we could celebrate the night. Hush, my babies, don't you cry. Don't look like me, but I'm here inside. Sit and burn the candle on both ends every night. Falling down and getting up, learning a new life. Life of a survivor, facing new desires. Won't sit down, gotta ignite us. Holding on, yes, I've had enough, but I'm not giving up. On my darkest days, the love will hold me up. I will survive, and I choose hope. I've come this far, I wanna see what's next. I'm not letting go. If I don't wake up tomorrow, I got no regrets, so I choose hope. Count the blessings till my very last breath.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reignite Your Purpose Conversations with Munira. I am Munira Premji, and I welcome you to the second of a 6-part series on self-improvement. Last week, we covered the topic of self-awareness. We talked about internal self-awareness and external self-awareness. And you each had a chance to work through your values, and you got exposed to a tool called the Johari window. And so I'm so hoping that in this past week, you've had a chance to take those tools and those models out for a spin and used them. I know it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of bravery to try something new. And you know that you are worth it. So give those a whirl, and we'd love to hear about your experiences with using these tools, your successes, challenges that you may have had. We'd love to hear from you. So today's session is all about perception. What is perception? Simply put, perception is how we take in information from our senses. So our sight, our taste, touch, hearing, how we take in this information and how we organize and interpret this information. It's a way for us to navigate the world around us. And this process actually helps us function every day, day by day, day to day, moment by moment. But there is so much more to perception. According to research, what we know is that the human body sends 11 million bits of information per second to the brain for processing. And the conscious mind can only process about 50 bits of information per second. So our brain cannot take it all in. So what does the brain do? It selects the data it wants to take in. It then organizes it, and then it creates interpretation. It is this selection, organizing, and interpretation that forms our perception. And what makes things really interesting about perception is that each one of us, each one of you, perceives things differently from each other. So you and a friend can experience the same event or situation at the same time, say watching a movie together. And both of you could come away from watching that movie with completely different memories and experiences. I mean, you could say, that was the worst movie I ever saw. And I could say, that was like the best movie in a long time, right? And I have to tell you that the older I've gotten, the more I've come to realize that the way we perceive things has a direct effect on our thoughts, on our actions, on our behaviors. In fact, I would say on the quality of our life. But before we delve deeper into this topic, I want to introduce to you my friend Leila Rahemtulla, who is the guest speaker for the session today. Leila is an educator and management consultant with 25 years experience. She is an instructor at Simon Fraser University and BCIT, where she teaches organizational behavior, leadership and instructor development. She is also a consultant and works with public and private sector organizations to help them develop competency in leadership and soft skills. Leila is the author of Reignite the Passion in Your Work and Your Life. And I've had a chance to read Leila's book, and it very much reads like she speaks. Leila is an advocate for people with intellectual disabilities, and she volunteers as a curriculum designer and facilitator for programs delivered within the Ismaili community in Canada and the US. And in 2018, I was just so thrilled that Leila was honored with the YWCA Woman of Distinction Award in the area of education, training, and development. I met Leila for the very first time, I think it was in 2017, when we both worked on a project with a really talented team of people to create volunteer training for the Diamond Jubilee for Canada. And, it started as a professional relationship, and very quickly it became a relationship of trust and of friendship. And I admire Leila so very much, not only because of her competence in this area of leadership and organizational development, but it is who she is and who she chooses to be and what she brings into the world. And I just know that the world is a better place for having Leila in it. So welcome, my friend, Leila.
Thank you. Thank you. You're so kind and generous. And I think that's why I keep coming back. I always feel so good after your introduction. So thank you, all of you, for joining us again and for letting us be on this journey with you. This has been such an exciting process to work on putting these sessions together. And I think today's topic was particularly important as a follow-up for what we started with last week. And so I'm so excited to look at perceptions. When you were talking, Munira, I was thinking about that phrase, perception is reality. And so for us, it's what we believe to be true. It's our stories. And it's really important for us to start to think about that, because that is then how the world shows up for us. How we take in the world is really our experience. And that ultimately then starts to impact how we're interacting with the world, because we can't help but organize and interpret and think about, okay, so what's going on here? And now how am I going to react with the world? So if we're thinking about the way we're going to show up and live that best life, and hopefully with your homework, live those values, we've got to figure out what stories we're telling ourselves, what stories we might be using to interpret the world, and whether or not that's accurate or not. And if there's not, what is it that we want to do about it? So I'm really excited about our next hour together in exploring this. Thank you.
And what you provided right now, Leila, was a wonderful summary of everything that we will be covering today. So yes, welcome everybody. And we ask that you bring your curiosity, your engagement, and your participation in today's workshop. And so I thought we would start by doing something a bit different today. I'm going to share a couple of graphics with you, and I would love for you to let us know through the chat function what it is that you see. All right, so let's give it a few seconds, and we'd love to get your feedback on the chat. What is it that you see when you see this picture? What do you see, Leila?
So I've seen this before.
Yes.
But interestingly enough, I saw exactly what I saw the first time I saw this, and that is a young woman. She's looking away from us, and so you see her jaw. You can see the sort of tip of her nose and her eyelashes. And she's wearing a choker and kind of a big headdress, and there's a feather coming out of the top. So yeah, that's what I see, a young woman.
let's talk about this a little bit more. What do you think her name might be, Leila?
No. Well, I think she's from France. I think she lives in Paris and she's a dancer. I think her name's Suzette.
Did you say Gisette? Giselle?
Suzette.
Suzette. Suzette. Okay. Huh. Well, I don't see Suzette.
What do you see?
I see a really old woman,
Mm.
perhaps in her 80s. And I get the sense that she's very sad.
Mm.
And I almost want to go over to give her a hug and to ask her if everything's okay. And she looks like Remat Bai to me.
Okay.
So based on what I'm seeing, it seems like some people can see what you see, Leila, and some can see what I see. And so, as you have probably gathered, that one picture really consists of two pictures. So we're going to keep it up for a couple more seconds so that hopefully you can see both.
Yes. And so I think if you help by looking at the image, the mouth, what I thought was the choker, you're actually seeing as the old
mouth.
mouth. And what I saw was the jawline was the old woman's nose. So imagine that curve is a nose. And the old woman's got a shawl around, and what was a feather for Suzette, for Ramithbai was her hair out of place. You know,
Exactly.
She's got that one gray hair that just doesn't want to cooperate.
But I did want to bring another point here, and it's something you already alluded to, and that is the first time I saw this picture was probably 30 years ago, and I saw Remat Bai first.
Okay.
And it is incredible to me that every time I show this picture when I'm facilitating workshops, etc., I always see Remat Bai first, and I have to really shift perspective to see your young gal. And so I wanted to bring that up because I think that's really critical. And what that tells me is that as human beings, we have very much something called the lock and load. First impressions matter. And first impressions stay a long time. And, it takes effort to shift that first impression.
That's so interesting because, again, when you talk about the fact that we're taking in millions of pieces of information of the many more millions of pieces that are available to us, what are we attending to? And so it isn't, because we're doing this in just a couple of seconds, we have probably patterns that we're naturally doing. And I didn't think about that. I'd seen this picture before, and what did I see first? But maybe those patterns are there without us actually analyzing. And it wasn't until we took in more information that we wouldn't have paid attention to, or we used a framework from someone else that let us look at things. And it reminds me of the quote from Wayne Dyer, where he says, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. And so we really did get to that place where we were able to see the same thing with a different set of eyes almost.
Yeah. And sometimes what that takes is a collaboration and asking the other person, this is what I see. What is it that you see? It could be as simple as that. Okay, this is kind of fun. Let me do another one.
Okay.
All right. We're going to keep this for a few seconds and ask everybody who's participating today, what is it that you see? Yeah, and just enter your responses in the chat function. Okay, Leila, what do you see?
I see two people looking at themselves or looking at each other, sorry. Yeah, what do you see?
I see a vase.
Oh my gosh. How do we ever work together?
So it seems like, the folks who are participating some see the vase, and I think more people can see the vase, and some see the faces. So let me show you this in a different way so that hopefully we can all see both.
So you swapped out the negative space to be white rather than black.
I did, right. So now those are the faces. Now let me go back to the original.
Okay.
And hopefully now we can see the faces.
I didn't not see the vase, but I felt like I needed to make faces. I tend to, even when I'm looking at tiles, if there's tiles and there's a random pattern, I'm looking for the eyes and the nose and the mouth.
Interesting. Interesting, Leila. Creativity, clearly one of your values. And so, some of us attended to the black part of the image. Some of us attended to the white part of the image. And again, it's not right or wrong. It literally is the data we pick up and how we process the information. Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Well, I'd like us to take a deeper dive in perception, and want to introduce you to a model that is truly one of my favorite models, because what this model does, and it's called the ladder of inference, and what it does is it gives you a language of perception, and you can actually see, using the metaphor of a ladder, how we form perceptions and how quickly we come to action. So here's a deeper dive on perception. I want to share with you something called the ladder of inference, which has been a game changer for me in terms of how I interact with the world. The ladder of inference is a simple model that shows how we can so easily jump to conclusions. It describes the thinking process we go through without even realizing it, to get from observing something to making judgments and taking actions. This model was developed by Chris Argyris. At the bottom of the ladder is the actual data. It is clear and observable. We select data from what we observe. And because we can't pay attention to all the data, we consciously or even subconsciously make choices about what data to select and what to ignore. We then add meaning and create stories from the data and make assumptions and interpretations. Our interpretation may not be the same for everyone. It is based on experience, our culture, our values, our beliefs. We then draw conclusions based on our interpretations and then take actions. So let me give you an example so that the ladder makes sense for you and comes alive for you. Imagine a grade 3 teacher. She's new to the school. She sees Johnny in the playground. She selects data. Johnny is with a group of friends. He is loud. He's taking up a lot of space. He's not letting anyone else talk. He looks aggressive. She makes interpretations. Johnny is bossy. He is a troublemaker. He looks like he's going to take up a lot of her time. She starts to feel anxious, and her body is feeling it. She notices that her shoulders get tight. She clenches her teeth. She remembers a similar kid that she had at her last school who gave her a lot of trouble. And she's not happy about having Johnny be in her class. And in this situation, how do you think she's going to treat Johnny? Chances are she's going to keep her eye on him. Chances are she's going to catch him do wrong. And chances are she's going to discipline him often. Now, imagine another grade 3 teacher, also new to the school. She sees Johnny in the playground. She selects data. Johnny is with a group of friends. He is optimistic. He's having fun. Everyone's listening to him. He's using great vocabulary. He's engaged. And this teacher is starting to make interpretations. Wow, what a natural leader. He's confident. He's excited. He's probably gifted. She gets excited and her body is feeling it. She's smiling and looking forward to actually meeting Johnny. She remembers a kid in her last school, just like Johnny, who was, the best student she had. Now, how do you think she is going to treat Johnny? Chances are she will encourage him, she will ask him questions, she will give him leadership opportunities. Now, think about it for a moment. Did Johnny change? No. Johnny is Johnny is Johnny. So what happened here? Perception. Two people can see the same thing at the same time and take something different from it. Now you will notice that each rung of the ladder is dependent on the rung before it. So the data that the teachers selected based on their own worldview led them to different conclusions and informed the actions that they took. But what is fascinating about this model is that the data that you select, the interpretations that you make, the conclusions you reach, all happen in your head. What people see is the action that you take without actually knowing how you got there. Now, the move up the ladder of inference takes milliseconds. It happens all day long. It happens when we interact with others, when we watch the news, when we're deciding what car to buy. Every interaction that we're having with ourselves or with others, we are constantly observing, judging, interpreting, and making conclusions. And most times this works for us, except when it doesn't. And when it doesn't work, that's when the ladder of inference is particularly useful. When you have a difference of opinion with someone, you can literally go down the ladder and start over. Ask questions, get curious, put yourself in the other person's shoes, invite dialogue respectfully, make your thinking more explicit, and really listen. Because when you do this, you come away with a better understanding of the other person and the situation. The ladder of inference is also a very useful tool you can use on yourself. So when you're not getting the results that you want in life, go down the ladder and see what data you are selecting. Perhaps the data is not accurate. Maybe you need additional information. Maybe the assumptions that you're making is not correct. So this gives you a chance to take a pause and consider other perspectives. The ladder of inference is my all-time favorite tool and something I use daily. It has helped me work through conflicts effectively. It has also helped me understand that the data I select will really determine the actions I take and the quality of my life. Now let's work through the ladder of inference together. All right. If you have any feedback, comments, questions about the ladder of inference based on what you just saw, again, feel free to comment on those. Leila, your thoughts. What strikes you about the ladder of inference?
So interesting. I mean, this really sort of speaks to, haven't we all been Johnny?
The question is which Johnny?
Yeah, which Johnny? And well, see, here's the thing: is I don't think Johnny changed, right? You remarked on that, and yet we know there's been people in our life who've seen us as the sort of good Johnny and the less good Johnny, and how have they interacted with us, and what impact has that had on us? And so when we're starting to look at that. The look at ourselves, that microscopic truth that we've been exploring. We also want to think about the interactions we've had with others, because how they've interacted with us may have also shaped our understanding, our actions and our reactions. And so I'm thinking about that. I've also done this a lot of times, and I'm sure you have too. Do you have any examples of when this has happened to you, when you've gone up the ladder?
Oh my, so many, so many. But the one that has really struck me, and it was an interesting one, was a couple of years ago when I attended a wedding, and I went with my husband, and the bride brought this wonderful couple to us. And she said, I really want to introduce you to my boss, who is the director of the Diabetes Association. I think the boss was actually the CEO. And very immediately, I looked at the gentleman and I said, I am so glad to finally meet you. And, you do such great work. Diabetes is a really big issue for so many people. And as I'm speaking with him, I notice that the bride is feeling a little bit mortified. And very quickly, the gentleman said, oh, it's not me, that's the CEO, it's my wife. And I swear, I just felt like I just wanted to crawl into a hole, and that has really struck me. And it has also informed the way that I interact with people I don't know. I don't make those assumptions, or I don't make them all the time. So that was one that really struck for me. I know you have some pretty awesome stories about the letter of inference and about the cubby holes. So please share those.
Sure. I love, and thank you for sharing that, because I think we have these life lessons, we have these experiences, and when we reflect back on our life, there are pivotal moments where something happened to us, we had an experience, and it just lets us see something differently for the rest of our lives. Yes. We just will never be able to go back and not see it that way. And so I think that speaks to how powerful this concept is. When I talk about this in my classes, I talk about the fact that the organization piece that you were talking about earlier, in terms of we take in all of this information that is just a subset of the information that is available to us. When we take that information in, even though it's a much smaller amount, we still have to store it some way. And our brains kind of create these cubby holes that information is going to be put in. And so when we start to think about that, we put it in there because we might need to retrieve it. So right. This happened when you're new in a job, you say, okay, this is the person I'm going to work with. I need to remember their name. Okay, let me put all the names of the people that I work with into the work cubby hole. And we have a recipe cubby hole. And
yes,
this is the recipe I need to have. And I now know I can, draw back from it. And if it was a good recipe, you draw from it often. If it was a bad recipe, in goes the information that this isn't a great recipe.
Yes, I resonate.
So the stories I had were actually ones that my brother does similar work to this inside of policing and law enforcement. And he has a colleague who works with the FBI, and he shared these stories. And I just think they're so powerful in terms of looking at perception. So Bob talks about the fact that he carries a firearm. That's part of his job. And when he travels on planes, he has to let the flight crew know that he has a firearm. There's two things he needs to do. He needs to do that, and he needs to also find out from them if there's anyone else on the plane that has a firearm, because the last thing you want to do is have two men with guns or two people with guns right. surprise each other. So if there's an air marshal or some other law enforcement individual, they just need to know about one another. So he usually discreetly tells the flight crew, and he says, when you get a moment, if you could just let me know if there's anybody else. I do have a firearm, just want to let you know. So he's sitting down and he's settling in, and he's opened up his briefcase, and he's sitting next to this older woman. His briefcase opens up, and he's got a picture of his family, his wife, his children. And she looks over and can't help but look at this lovely family. So she goes, oh my goodness, what a beautiful family. Are those your children? And he said, yes, I travel a lot for my work. And I just always want to be able to remember who's waiting for me at home and why I do what I do, because they're the reasons I wake up in the morning. So it's just a really beautiful, sort of reflection. And she looked at him with such adoring eyes. It was like he was the son he'd never had. So she put him into the cubby hole of son I never had. What a good man, what a good family man who's, looking after his family. And then the flight attendant came up to him and said, Mr. Reese, I just need to let you know you're the only one. And she gives him a little wink. And she was telling him that he was the only one on the plane that was carrying a firearm. Unfortunately, this woman sitting next to him saw that little interaction
And the
went
wink?
right up the ladder of inference very quickly and inferred that that was not an appropriate conversation. What's with the wink? And so suddenly she pulled him out of that cubbyhole and shoved him in the cubbyhole of lying, cheating, schmarmy, sleazy salesperson. When the cat's away, he's going to play, and, all this kind of terrible stuff. And he says, I could feel the hate stare that, I couldn't even make eye contact with her, but he goes, it was so icy. She never spoke to me for the rest of the flight. And he goes, there was no way for me to get back into the good sun cubbyhole because she'd made her decision.
Yeah. And so it took milliseconds.
Seconds. And so he said, in defense of this woman, I do it too. And so he gave another example of being on a plane again. And he was sitting next to a gentleman, and the pilot had just come over the intercom and said, we're cruising at about 34,000 feet. So this man sort of reached over and looked out the window and kind of got into Bob's space. And he said, I actually think we're closer to 33,000 feet. And he was a bit taken back, and he was thinking, oh, it's going to be one of those flights. A Mr. Know-it-all who knows nothing about flying, but, has to one-up the pilot. And so he was like, I'm not going to make eye contact. So right up the ladder of inference, he now had a behavior. I'm not going to interact with this guy. And then the flight attendant came by and said, Mr. Stafford, would you like another drink? And so now he was thinking, Stafford, wait a minute. And he started looking in his cubby holes. In his brain, he's thinking, I know that name. And then he's thinking, Stafford? I think there's an astronaut named Stafford. He goes, you don't happen to be Tom Stafford, the astronaut? And he says, yes, as a matter of fact, I am. And he had to pull him out of the annoying, passenger cubbyhole and put him into the I'm not worthy to sit next to you and let me worship the ground you walk on kind of how cool is it to sit next to an astronaut. And so those were really good examples of how quickly we perceive what we make it mean, the stories we tell ourselves, and then ultimately what actions come as a result of them. And so it was just, those are really powerful ones that I often share, just to let people know that it's human nature for us to do this, but there's implications when we do.
And I never tire of these stories. I just love the story because it really is the letter of inference in action. And what I wanted to also offer to everybody who's listening is that, whatever you see, and the action that you take is the only thing that's external. But think about it, the data you select, how you organize it, the stories you tell, the interpretations you make, the conclusions you reach. Guess where all of that is happening? It's happening in your head. And so where I'd like to take this conversation is the letter of inference. I mean, we need that. I mean, it's what helps us operate day to day, right? Except when it doesn't. So when we are in a situation where we have a conflict with a loved one, when we're in a situation where we have a disagreement, for instance, then what we need to do is we need to come down the ladder. We need to come down the ladder in order to make sense of what's going on and understand other options and perspectives. Right?
I have to say that happened while we were preparing for this session. So love my husband dearly, want to put that out there. However, we can sometimes get into each other's spaces. And so certainly during pandemic, working from home, we have been together much more intensely than in the past. And there was a commotion that was happening when you and I were having our meeting. And I was like, what is going on here? And don't those guys know that I'm working? And so I immediately felt myself, not even upstairs, but just, really just having that reaction to, boy, they're irritating. And so it because we happened to be just talking about this ladder, I caught myself and I said, wait a second. I don't know what's happening up there. And have I just made a story about this being an interruption?
Yeah, like what assumptions are you making?
I had to pull myself down. And as I went to go investigate, I was gathering some more data. So I was asking some questions and I was like, hey, what's going on over here? However, we have patterns. And when I interrupt my work and I step out and I start asking questions, that is also someone else's perception. So when I asked my husband what was going on, he perceived that he'd interrupted me and that he was like, I didn't interrupt you, and all this kind of stuff. And he went up the ladder. And at that point, we couldn't have a conversation because, neither of us really wanted to speak. But the interesting thing is, a few minutes later, he came back in and he said, sorry, I overreacted. And I said, it's okay. I was actually just asking some questions because I didn't understand what was happening upstairs. But we just happened to be doing this ladder of inference. And I realized when I was walking up the stairs, I might have made some assumptions. And so that's the reason I was asking questions, was I needed to actually gather more data because I didn't have enough. And my mom had a saying. She says, sometimes when people give you 2 and 2, you make 22. And that's the ladder of inference. And so I said, I wanted to just gather more data, but I said, I understand that the way you interpret it, you made me, or you heard me accusing you of something. And so I explained the ladder to him, which actually solidified the ladder to me so clearly. And it reminded me of something I share with my students, and that is, if you ever want to really understand something, explain it to someone else. Because in that moment, we actually both came down the ladder. We were able to share information and then move on from it. And so it didn't ruin our day. It didn't ruin that moment. It just was give us an opportunity to say, this perceptual error happened. We became aware of it and we understood. And this is the Johari window in action. So for those of you who were there last week and you got to see the Johari window, this is how we open the Johari window, through feedback and disclosure. This is what I saw. This is what was going on for me, talking about that inference. And so this tool is a really powerful add-on tool to your toolkit in understanding yourself, but also understanding how you're interacting and showing up in the world.
Such a nice tie-in. That's brilliant. Thank you for doing that. And thank you for sharing these stories. We promised that when we would do these sessions, that we would be vulnerable because, we are like you and we have our own flaws and our own gifts. And we just wanted to be real with you so that you could understand that this happens all the time. And the idea is that we are works in progress. And the idea is to catch ourselves in these kinds of situations. So I wanted to say that I use the letter of inference extensively. I mean, I use this every day. It is certainly a language in our family. So whenever there is any disagreement, or not even disagreement, but there may be a task to accomplish, we may have different approaches on how to get that task done, right? And I may have a very strong view, and a family member may have an equally strong view. In those cases, we go down the ladder and say, okay, let's go down and let's really think about this. What is the data you're selecting? What's fascinating is that we may not necessarily agree at the end of it. Sometimes we do. Sometimes it's like, oh, I get why this is so important to you, and I hadn't thought about it this way. And yes, let's definitely do it your way. But what it does is it increases understanding. And I use this very much in corporate world, and I use this in my coaching practice. Whenever I hear a client who's having trouble with their boss, for instance, I share the letter with them and I'll say, tell me about the data you're selecting. And is this the correct data? And so this is a model that you can use in every aspect of your life.
I'm so glad you started to think about or share the sort of applications of this, Munira, because I was thinking about one acronym that I got from a client group, and it was MRI, most
Yes.
respectful interpretation. And MRI is one of the ways that metaphorically we hit the pause button, or we stop on the ladder and we say, okay, I feel myself going up. I feel myself taking this few bits of information and starting to make it mean something. Let me just take a moment, take a pause, step away and be a bit more objective. Is this really happening in this negative interpretation, or might there be another version of this? And so what it does is it allows us to try to have more accuracy to our interpretation of what's going on around us. And the example that came up for me was when my children were younger, we often tried to multitask and get things done. I was teaching in the evenings, and there was one day where I'd pick them up from childcare and there was going to be no time to make dinner. So I had to do what every mom knows that you need to do sometimes, and that was pick up dinner at a drive-through. So I'm in this packed drive-through, and the kids are, they've had a bit of a tough day. They're not in great moods. I'm already thinking about the fact that I have to get to work once I drop the kids home. And the car behind me honks. Now, if you've ever been in a drive-through, sort of a lane, that there's nowhere to go until the car in front of you moves. And I'm pretty sure that the car behind me can see the car in front of me. So I'm thinking, what are you honking about? Now, by the grace of God, I didn't have the language of MRI, but I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw a mom, and she's got a tiny little baby, and she's trying to change a diaper on her steering wheel. Because when you need to change a diaper, you kind of have to go with it, right? And so I went from ladder of inference, what kind of jerk honks in a drive-through, to, oh my gosh, I remember when I was at that stage, and I just had compassion and empathy for her, because I was like, I know what that smell could be like in a car. And she's just trying to deal with it. Right? And so, but it was this moment where MRI, the most respectful interpretation, said, stop. No one would deliberately, honk. And so, 99% of the world doesn't wake up in the morning to try to make each other's lives difficult. We're just living our lives. And what we have to do is we have to remember that we're making stories. And so we have to be, just like we called Suzette and Remitbai. I mean, we made up those stories. And they were very compelling stories, but they had no accuracy. They were just based on what we made up in our head. And so I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves that, one, let's not get caught up in the negative stories that we might be telling ourselves about our experiences. And then also, when we're interacting with the world, to hit that pause button, because I think it does impact you ultimately in the way that you show up as well. I remember a friend of mine shared a story with me, and she was listening to a keynote speaker, and he talked about the fact that he and his community had gone through a very difficult time. And he says, there's 3 ways I could choose to be. I could choose to be a victim because we lived a horrible past and it was hard, and I could do that. But I realized that if I live as a victim, I lose my power and my past defines me. And then he said, I had a choice to be a survivor. And my survivorship allowed me to say, okay, well, I made it through. But he said, I still felt like my past was defining me. And so he says, I choose now today to live as a thriver. And so what he did was he did that Wayne Dyer piece where he changed the way he looked at things. He isn't at all, or he wasn't at all wanting to lose his past. I think our past is our past, but that's where it belongs. And so we understand it. We look at that microscopic truth, and then we say, we've already done our values work. We know what's important. Let's thrive in our values rather than live in some of those places where our values were astray. And I just thought that was a powerful application of this exercise to do what we've asked you all to do, and that is look at yourself and think about how you can reignite and be the best version of you. You have the answers of what that is. And what's amazing is that each of you has your unique gifts. we want to get all of the stuff that gets in the way of you showing those gifts to yourself and to others. And some of that will be removing some of the stories that aren't really useful.
Wow, there's so much great stuff that came out of this piece, and I don't even know what pieces to take from there. But one is a quote by Stephen Covey, which is one of my favorites, which is, "We do not see things as they are; we see things as we are." So when we shift who we are, we see the world differently.
Mm.
Which really tied into the victim, survivor, thriver piece. The other piece, and this was a little bit emotional for me, but as I was listening to you, Leila, I was thinking that pre-cancer, so 8 years ago, I was a very different person. And, I didn't have a lot of patience or compassion for individuals who were not as fast as me, or who couldn't think as quickly as me, and who needed time. And it's unfortunate, but that's, now upon reflection, I'm seeing that. But in 8 years, I've been through a huge roller coaster with 3 cancers. And yes, I've had to use a wheelchair. And yes, I've had chemo brain, and oftentimes I'd go to an elevator and I'd forget how that works. Or, I would need help to climb the stairs. And I think what it did is it shifted my perception so significantly that I think I became a lot more compassionate, because I put myself in the shoes of individuals who were struggling. And because I had been through those struggles, I could literally firsthand, relate. And I think we live in this kind of world today, right? We live in this world where everything is instant. You want to know what something is, you just ask Siri, right? Mm-hmm. It's just in this instant world. And so in the past, when people wouldn't respond immediately to what I was asking or to a request, I would go up my ladder right away, and it was not a good place to be in those circumstances. Now I take that pause that you talked about, and I think there's something to be said about it. So yeah, thank you. There was so much there that I was trying to pull threads from what you were saying to make this a more robust conversation. And I'm really hoping that, every one of you who's listening to us is finding your own stories and finding your own application, and seeing examples of where you may have gone up the ladder, where you've needed to come down the ladder, and how, you may have changed your life based on experiences. In my case, it was, real hardship that caused me to get there. But for some more self-enlightened souls, it wouldn't have been hardship. It would be because that's the way you operate in the world.
Right. Yeah. I had a dear friend of mine share with me something that I think relates to personal growth very much. And she said, when I'm going into a new setting, I try to sit with people who are different from me.
Yes.
And I was just blown away by how wise that was. Because what she said was, I know that if I sit with people who are like me, I'm just going to reinforce what I already know.
Right.
And when I sit with people who are different, I'm going to learn. And so when we think about the journey of discovery and what we're thinking about in terms of personal growth, all of you may be looking at, what can I do to put myself into situations where I'm going to interact with people who are different from me? And can I bring with me the openness to learn? Because now that you have this ladder, you can also spend some time with the pause button on and say, what does this person have to teach me? What can I learn? And not just teach me about them, but what do they teach me about myself? And that's what I heard, Munira, with your story, was that you actually learned that about yourself. And as a result of it, I think are even more compassionate than you already are. Because I think even before the 8 years of your journey with cancer, you were a compassionate person. That's what the core.
Not really, but we'll take it.
You know, I'm pretty sure you're
Yeah.
okay,
But I
and
think
as
this,
everyone is, right?
yeah,
We
I
just get to be better versions of ourselves.
right. This takes us actually to a really nice segue to the next component that I think would be great to share with you. You know, we are so about giving you models and strategies, having conversations, you know, and inviting you into our world, you know, as we do this, so that we learn from each other and we grow and we become better. So
Yes.
the next piece is, so hopefully by now you've figured out, you know, what perception is and why it is so important and how we perceive things really has an impact on the quality of our life, right? And you've heard some fabulous examples. Love those airplane examples of how we go up our ladder and how when things are not going well, we need to come down our ladder, right? Now what we want to do is we want to add another layer and give you some questions that you may want to ask when you find that you want other perspectives. So are there questions that you ask, Leila,
Yeah.
when you're kind of stuck?
So again, just to kind of tie in last week's material, we gave you the Johari window. And the Johari window, if you remember, was about feedback and disclosure. So when we're starting to want to learn more about ourselves and maybe about others, we can start to ask some questions. So really, this is the Johari window in action. We might do MRI, most respectful interpretation, for objectivity. And so the question might be, what's the objective view of this? If I were to take a step back and look at it from a bird's eye view, would I look at it differently? Another one that sort of comes up with me is how would my mentor, how would somebody who I really value in terms of who they are as a human being, how would they react to the situation? And so what I try to do is I try to learn from others. And there's so many people in my life that I'm blessed with. My family, my friends, my children. My children are such powerful teachers. And so when I start to think about it, I might ask myself, how would that person who I cherish for this value that they bring, how would they react? Or how would they interpret the situation? And so what that does is it lets me also be open to the people around me. Those are two that kind of came up for me. How about you?
I really resonated with the second one that you mentioned because I do that all the time. When I find that I'm really stuck in a situation, rather than hitting my head and doing the same thing over and over and over again, I'll actually take a break, and then I will come back. And for me, it's I will tell you honestly, it's Sabrina. I will often say, how would Sabrina respond to this particular situation? And it's fascinating just asking that question. Just asking that question. And sometimes it's not Sabrina. Sometimes I might say, how might Batman respond to this situation, or Wonder Woman, and it brings a little bit of levity, but what it does, it suddenly opens up the door, and suddenly I'm inviting something in my space that says, I have this one perspective, but how might Batman respond to this situation? And all of a sudden there's other viewpoints that come in, because that's what perspective is all about, right? It's what is the data you're selecting, because the data that you select will determine everything else. The data that you select will determine whether you're tense or stressed or feeling joyful, or the interpretations, the conclusions, and the actions that you will take. So it starts with the data. And so, so that one really resonated for me.
Okay.
And I think the other one, that's a really easy one. The first question I ask, when there is a disagreement is, what assumptions am I making? Because oftentimes, and this is particularly true in a work setting, I find, the minute I ask and I will say, these are the assumptions I'm making, and I make my thinking known. These are the assumptions I'm making. All of a sudden, it's like the other person is saying, oh, I get it because I'm making these assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So
Yeah,
that's another question.
yeah. I loved earlier on you said something around, we all do this, and this is our perfect imperfection. And so when we start to look at this, we're hoping that you don't look at yourself and say, oh, I've done this so many times and now you're beating yourself up about this. There's a phrase that I was once given that has resonated with me and stays with me. And that is, it isn't how many times we've fallen up, it's how quick, or fallen down, it's how quickly we get ourselves up again. And so I think it's around taking an experience, and if it's been a negative one or it's one that you say, I don't want to do that again, ask yourself what you learned from it. And so when we start to look at our own development, we start to think about the development is really going through and saying, what did that moment teach me? Teach me about myself. And if I want to stay on track and not lose sight of my values, what do I need to do differently next time? And so that's been really helpful for me. And I may stop making that mistake, but then I'll make a whole bunch of other ones. And
Yeah.
so we are works in progress. But what I find is that every time we do that and we stay aligned to our goals, it feels right, and it feels like we're able to do this in a much more impactful way. Life is going to be life,
Yeah.
and it's going to be like that. But I think when we can make the most of it, even the negative experiences, and I mean, when I read your book, Munira, I was just so amazed at your positivity and the way your outlook, and the way that you took a journey that you would never want anyone to have to go through, and made it a powerful learning experience, not just for yourself, but for those you chose to share it with. And really, you've just been so generous with that. I think that has shifted you because you were never a victim. There was no space for a victim to be, because you already realized, I've got bigger purpose. I've got work to do, and this is my work, and these are my values. So it's what I admire about you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Leila. Much appreciate that. Oof,
It's a lot.
it's a lot. But my hope is that the letter of inference will give you some language, because I got to tell you, once you see it and once you practice it and once you keep using it, you will find that this is probably a tool that you will use in so regularly. And so maybe this is a good time to talk about the 315, Leila.
Yay.
Okay.
So hopefully you had a chance to do your homework. For those of you who are joining us for each week we will give you a little homework piece, not because we're mean, but because we're so committed to your journey. And so we wanted to give you your content and our conversation as a springboard for your work. So 315 is taking 3 people in your life that you trust, that you value their opinion, that you want to interact, and you want to join you on this journey. And you're going to spend 15 minutes with them. So the 315 this week will be looking at 3 questions. One is, what's an example that you have to share? So think about the ladder of inference for yourself. When did you go up that ladder so fast your head was spinning? What's that example? And share that example with them, and then share your reflections on about maybe what would my do-over be, or what did I learn about myself now that I've got this framework. The second one that we'd like you to do is, with each of the 3 people, share the ladder. Remember earlier I said, if you can't teach something you don't know. And so if you can share this ladder, it'll be interesting, because I found that it deepened my understanding of it. So be attentive and be present to, as you're sharing it, what you learn and how it deepens your understanding. And then finally, to pick up again on the Johari window and a little bit of your values. Invite that person to reflect on their experiences with you. What do they know about you? And maybe have they seen you been up that ladder? Or they might want to share their example of when they've done that. and be in the listening. Be in the listening for their example to say, what does that person teach me in this moment? Because that might be what your homework is about, is in that moment just to learn from that other person. So that's your 315. It shouldn't take you more than 45 minutes, but what you put into it, you will get out of it. I promise that that is worth it. And as Munira said at the beginning, you're worth it. So we really want you to take these on.
We also very much want to have you share your experience of using the tools and using the models. So, as you're doing these activities, if you have stuff that you'd like to share with us, your successes, how this has helped you in any way, or challenges that you may have faced, because, these are new tools and they take a little bit of work, to become familiar with, right? Or questions that you may have, then we will invite you, when you get your feedback form for each session, indicate that you want to share your learning and give us your email address, and we will connect back with you, because we'd love to get a sense of the work that we're doing and whether it's really adding any value for you. So again, the way to do that is feedback form, email address, and we will be in touch with you. And maybe later we end with our favorite quotes on perception.
Great. So mine comes from the Dalai Lama, and it is, the ability to shift perspective can be one of the most powerful and effective tools we have to help us cope with life's daily problems.
So wise. Mine is from somebody called Brian Johnson, and he says, the trick to recognize that our vantage point is only one of many partial truths, and to appreciate the different perspectives from which others see the world. So the trick is to recognize that our point of view is only one, and appreciate the different perspectives from which others see the world, because, we see the world not as it is, but as we are.
Really beautiful. Thank you again for having me join you.
Oh, my pleasure. So just a shout out, the session for next week is change and resilience. And it's really around how to bounce back when things get rough. And, this is probably a really good session, particularly during these unprecedented times, when a lot of us are feeling a little bit worn down. And so we look forward to having you join us next week, and take good care, and God bless.
Thanks, everyone. God bless.
Roadmap to my life. If I stand for something, maybe I can heal my tribe. Daring greatly to fuel this fire. Solid faith when reality lies. What happens in the darkness when fear and pain collide? Find the guiding light, stand for all who can't fight. Yes, we can break boundaries. No one won't stay silent. Be the change I wanna see. Gotta ignite